Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's episode, I have two announcements. First is that tickets are officially on sale for our live storytelling show, which is going to take place in Minneapolis, Minnesota on Saturday, April 22nd. This is a show on the topic of rebirth that we are producing in collaboration with the amazing Center for the Art of Medicine, housed at the University of Minnesota. And actually, today's guest, Tseganesh Selameab, is part of the amazing team that is making this event possible. So we hope that if you're located in the Midwest, you'll buy a ticket and come see us and come to the show. It should be a really wonderful night. Second, I just wanted to announce that the Nocturnists learned this week that we're nominated for 2 Webby Awards, which we're really excited about. The first nomination is for our Shame in Medicine, The Lost Forest series in the Health, Science, and Education podcast category. And the second nomination, which was much more surprising to us, was for our Conversation series, which we're so thrilled about. And that's in the Best Interview and Talk Show podcast category. We were pretty floored to see the Conversation series nominated there next to some of the greats like Jon Stewart and Kara Swisher. So we hope you'll visit our website and click the link to vote for us. Thank you so much to everybody who has made our show possible over the years. We're really, really grateful for the community that we've built. Now, on to today's episode. This episode of The Nocturnist is sponsored by FlipMD. FlipMD is a competitive marketplace where physicians can source and secure consulting side gigs. Jobs come from a broad range of clients across all major industries who are looking for medical experts in their field. FlipMD allows physicians to expand their careers through consulting and other non-clinical roles that fit their schedule and their interests. To learn more, visit flip-md.com. This season of The Nocturnist is sponsored by the Physicians Foundation. Support for The Nocturnist comes from the California Medical Association.
At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
You're listening to The Nocturnist, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. Today's episode features one of my favorite Nocturnist storytellers from over the years, primary care physician Tseganesh Selameab. Tseganesh is a primary care doctor, and in today's story, she brings us inside her practice as a provider for immigrants and refugees, and describes one of the most common ailments that she sees among her patients, which she calls homelonging. Tseganesh works as an internist and in the field of public health at the Ramsey County Public Health System, and she's also the Associate Director of the Center for the Art of Medicine at the University of Minnesota Medical School, where she organizes storytelling programming for medical education and practice. We'll hear more from Tseganesh about the amazing work that she does, but first, let's take a listen to the story that she told live on stage at the Nocturnist show in San Francisco in June of 2022. Here's Tseganesh.
It's cold that March morning when Rachel and I decide to meet up for our COVID coffee and walk. I had left our practice at the county hospital, and I hadn't seen Rachel for a while, so I was so excited to see her waiting for me outside of the downtown coffee shop. We grabbed our steaming cups of coffee, and we meandered down to the farmer's market while she told me that Julie was leaving county and all the new efforts of our chief of medicine to increase our productivity. We were kind of perusing the cheese and chutney and sharing pictures of our kids, hers, a not-so-little toddler, and my 3 rambunctious girls. And I was telling her the untold stories of the horrors of distance learning for our family. And it wasn't really until we crossed the Stone Arch Bridge and started zigzagging our way through these half-frozen puddles that we started sharing notes about one of my old patients, Haneen, that Rachel was now taking care of. So spoiler alert, I'm a primary care doctor, so I cure no one and I cure nothing. There was this one time I pulled out a retained tampon, and that is a story for another time. So I remember when I first met Haneen. I worked in the county hospital with this big workroom, and I sat on the computer kind of getting acquainted with her. She was complicated, which meant she had a lot of diagnoses and ICD-10 codes like diabetes, which is E11.9, hypertension, which is I10, and then she had more interesting ones like Sjogren's and seronegative arthritis, vitamin D deficiency, PTSD, and I read through all of that, kind of went through what her old primary care doctor had said about her, all the specialist notes, and that familiar green light went off on the computer, and I knew she was ready. So I made my way down these like white-tiled hallways, and I knocked on the door. I thought I heard her say, "Come in," so I walked in. And there was this woman who was sitting there, much, much older than the 61 that it said in her chart, and she looked a bit cross, and she wasn't really paying attention to me because she was too busy digging in the pocket of her walker looking for something she had to show me. So I went and I got my chair and I pulled it a little closer, and I counted 5 different braces that she had on that day. She had 2 that were supporting her wrist, 1 on her knee, and both of her ankles. So I took a deep breath and sat down and introduced myself to her as her new doctor. And I said, "Tell me, Haneen, how are you doing today?" And she said, "Doctor, I am not good. I am not good." And that's how we started most visits. That particular day, it was pain. That was the big thing she wanted me to address with her. So we came up with a plan, and she went home, and she'd had multiple follow-up visits, and at one point, she was really struggling with insomnia. She couldn't sleep, so I said to her, "Well, let's go up on the amitriptyline that we're using for your pain. Let's bump that up a little bit, and I'll have you come back and see me." So she came back. Amitriptyline did nothing for her insomnia, but it made her Sjogren's worse, and it made her have really dry, tacky mouth, and she felt horrible, so we went back down on the amitriptyline. Another time, she had this very weird stomach stuff that was going on. She was nauseous and couldn't eat. I had no idea what test to order for her. I knew it wasn't the meds, but I didn't know what test to order for her, and she'd go home. Haneen was an immigrant, and she would also come to me before she was getting ready to go home. So I would do her pre-departure visits. She would come, and I would go through her immunizations. She's typically gone for a while, so I would make sure she had enough medications for the time she was gone, and then we'd have that follow-up appointment set for when she came back. I loved those appointments. I loved waiting for her to tell me about what happened, and I would sit in that workroom again and wait for that green light, and I would walk a little quicker down the hallway and knock on the door. We'd get settled, and then she'd start telling me about what happened when she was home, all the things that she had experienced. And at some point, I would say, "All right, well, Haneen, let's talk about your health. How was your pain, your sleep, even this weird stomach stuff we were working on? How was that?" And she said, "Doctor, everything gets better when I go home." I too am a refugee. My family came here from Ethiopia in the late 80s. So home to me is a little mix of, y'all distressed jeans, which are really hip right now. We were the OGs with that. So home for me is a little mix of those distressed jeans with a netela that I would wrap around my shoulder. Home was clear Coke, right? Clear Coke with a little bit of injera that I would eat, or it sounded a lot like a little R&B and hip hop mixed with tizita. But I didn't get to go home for many years. It was 20 years. And then I was getting married. So for my wedding, we were gonna have everything be Ethiopian, right? We're gonna have Ethiopian music and food and dancing. And everyone in my wedding party had to wear an Ethiopian outfit. So my mom and I got on a plane and we went home. 20 years, I had no idea what to expect. But we get off the plane and I take a deep breath in and oh my gosh, I'm in my childhood. I am riding down these unpaved roads on this bike. I am in Sodere for our family vacations, but guarding my food from these vicious monkeys because they're a little aggressive. And I'm at my grandma's house. My grandma's not for Christmas Eve, right? My grandma's not really religious, but she wanted to make sure her grandkids knew what Christmas was about, so she would buy a huge Christmas cake, a birthday cake on Christmas Eve. And we would all stand around it, all her grandkids, and we would sing happy birthday to Jesus. It's just what you do. So we stayed in Addis for a while, tons of shopping. And one particular day, we go past this shop and there's a dress that my mom thinks will work really well for the mels, which is like the thing after the wedding. So we go in. If you know anything about Ethiopian shopping, it is a competitive sport. My mom is pro. So we walk into the shop, and before you know it, we are getting served some coffee and some tea. We're sitting down, and she's in her element discussing what kind of embroidery on what material, when was it gonna get ready, and let's get into the price. So I left. I had to get out. And I did. And I went outside, and I leaned over the balcony, and I wanted to go home. I wanted to go home. I wanted to walk around freely. I wanted to talk without making mistakes. I wanted to go to Target. It turns out it's really complicated for us refugees and immigrants. Home is not so much a place as it is a wound. We're branches that are growing on this tree, and one day a gardener comes along and rips this branch and says, I'm gonna graft you to this tree that is America. Grafting, to be successful, depends on connections even down to the vascular level. As immigrants and refugees, we know that. We look for our community. We look for connection in how we celebrate our rituals, our weddings, and our funerals. We look for connection in the spices for our kibe. We look for connection in our children. We name them the name of our ancestors, and we wait for them to speak to us in our native languages. We look for connections because we know if the connections are strong, not only does that branch survive, but it thrives and eventually produces flowers and fruit. But the opposite is also true. For many of us, those connections are really weak. They're really frail. And all we can do is survive and just hold on. And then what does a gardener do in that situation? A gardener makes salves and balms and tends to that branch and tries to salvage and see what can be recovered over many years. So the Monday after my walk with Rachel, I'm in my new practice. I have a standing desk now, and I love that. I'm between Mike and Chi, and there's a blue envelope that's waiting for me. The blue envelope tells me that there's a new arrival. One of the best parts of my new job is I get to take care of refugees when they first come here, sometimes within the first 72 hours. And I open up that blue envelope, I take out the paper, and there's a grainy picture of my patient in the left upper hand corner, and I flip through it for all of the diagnoses and ICD-10 codes and what their doctors had said before. The green dot comes on, and now I follow a gray carpet with some weird pattern on it to the door. Fee, our Korean interpreter, is waiting for me. So we knock on the door and walk in. There's a lovely grandma waiting for me with her even older and lovelier husband, and their daughter is also watching. So I pull up my chair. I sit down and introduce myself to them as their new doctor. And I say, tell me, how are you doing today?
So I am sitting here with Tseganesh Selameab. Tseganesh, thank you so much for being here today.
Excited, Emily. Thanks for having me.
So Tseganesh, you are one of the most beloved storytellers / collaborators / people in the Nocturnist family. And I was wondering if maybe you could start by telling the audience how you got involved with the Nocturnists.
I can't even remember when I first listened to your voice, Emily, and so you've kind of always been in my ear. You did that live show in San Francisco last year, which got me really excited, and went through the coaching process with you. I got to be in that show, and I went there with the sole mission. I told all my friends, I said, the reason I'm going to San Francisco is to have the Nocturnists do a show in the Midwest, and that's kind of full circle.
Yeah, so for the audience, Tseganesh is at the University of Minnesota at the Center for the Art of Medicine, and we are collaborating on a live performance in Minneapolis on Saturday, April 22nd. I'm just going to go ahead and plug it early in the interview because why not?
Totally.
And I'm just so excited to, be working with you in this capacity after falling in love with your voice back in the summer of 2020.
I've always believed in the power of storytelling, just in how we share our stories of our patients and how we talk about ourselves. And to be able to bring that storytelling to Minneapolis with like our friends and our community is going to be amazing. Incredible.
I love hearing about people's paths to medicine. So tell us about Tseganesh becoming a doctor. What is that journey?
So Tseganesh has always wanted to become a doctor. My parents don't know where it came from, but there's never been a second career or an alternate path. It's what I've always wanted to do since I was a little kid. When I was in Ethiopia, I grew up in Ethiopia. I came to the United States when I was 12. But when I was young, there were these first aid clubs that were really big in Ethiopia, and I was obsessed with first aid. I had gotten the book, and I would walk around pretending to like cure people, and I knew how to do the first aid carry when I was a little kid. So it's sort of what I've just never seen myself as anything other than being a physician. I had this idea when I was I tell this story with all seriousness. I thought, in my head, I was like, okay, when we came to the United States when I was 12 years old, I was like, well, I'm going to work in Africa because that's where all the need is. And I always imagined myself working there, and then there would be this prince, and he would be widowed, and I would save his children, and then we would fall in love and get married. And I thought that was exactly why I was going to go to medical school. Turns out didn't quite work out that way. And then when I was in college, so again, I always thought the real need was elsewhere. And then when I was in college, I started working a lot in the inner city, particularly in Chicago, and I was blown away at the disparities that were there. I just had not known. I hadn't known that people struggle to get food, and you had to make decisions about your medications and rent. And so when I was very young, it completely pivoted what I wanted to do with where I wanted to practice medicine. And so I really focused on that, on urban healthcare, and that included a ton of refugees and immigrants, at least in the communities that I lived in. And that was that. That's how I ended up in medicine.
You mentioned in your story, or at least in one of the versions of your story, that as a doctor for immigrants and refugees, you sometimes get to see people really early on, even within the first 72 hours of their arrival to the United States. Tell me more about your role as a doctor for this population. Is it always an initial intake appointment, or do you also take care of people, years and years after they've arrived, or what is that setup like?
I take care of all of the above. When I first started practicing in Minneapolis, I worked in our big county hospital in Minneapolis. And there, our immigrant populations that we saw were very established. So we have a huge Somali population that has been very prominent here since probably the 90s. And so we have people that have been here for 20, 30 years, first and second generations. We also had a lot of Vietnamese. And then when I crossed the river and went to St. Paul, even though they're really close to one another, it's like you've entered a different world. And all in the clinic that I worked in, we're seeing a ton of new Korean, Burmese refugees, and we're seeing a lot of Nepali patients and very brand new established patients, along with all the kind of populations I had seen at Hennepin as well. So we take care of everyone. The new arrival is more of a formal process of migration through the, resettlement programs. Minnesota has a lot of community organizations that do resettlement work, and we happen to be one of the established clinics where that work has been going on for a really long time. So we just end up seeing a lot of brand new refugees through that path.
So when you sit down with somebody who's just arrived, is it usually an individual or is it an entire family? And what is that more formalized process like? What does it entail? How is that visit or appointment structured? What are you looking for? What are you asking? Are you screening for things? Share a little bit about what that's like.
So when someone comes here through a resettlement program, they've usually lived in a refugee camp or have, sought asylum in a different country and have gone through some pre-departure screening that the CDC has recommended. And then upon arrival, they will be offered a visit at any clinic. But usually in Minnesota, a lot of this is done through the Department of Health, where they coordinate the information that is gathered in the pre-departure screening. It becomes a file. So I talk about it in my story as this envelope, but it really is this like blue envelope that has all the paper documents from their screening exams. And we're really fortunate in Minnesota that we have a strong public health department that organizes all of that and then refers refugees to particular clinics. So our clinic, there's a clinic in Hennepin County, there's some clinics throughout the cities that are used to doing this work and are used to accepting those patients. And so it's very organized. It's not always the case in other states where it is really that organized, that paperwork can get lost or people don't get follow-up in the way that they ought to. So that part is interesting. What you get access to really depends on where you land as an immigrant, what state you end up landing in. So they come here, and then we will sort of follow up on any chronic medical conditions that they have, get them to specialists if we need to get them to specialists or to dialysis or wherever else we need to get them to and kind of coordinate care for them and, finish immunizations and any additional screenings that we have to do as well.
I'm sure you've done this many different times with many different people from different countries, different settings, different contexts, different reasons for coming over to the United States. But I'm wondering if you've noticed any common threads in all of these intake appointments. Like, is there a question that people tend to ask, or what do you notice as you work with this population? It's just such a pivotal moment in life, like this moment of arrival. And I'm just curious if there are themes or patterns that come up.
I think the one thing that is consistently true is how other the experience is. Even though there's some preparations of what it's like to come to the United States from wherever you happen to be coming from, it is a completely other experience. Nothing about it is familiar, even in the doctor interactions. If you practice medicine in other countries, how you interact with doctors is completely different. Things that we take for granted, like autonomy and individual decision-making and patients having a right to refuse, all of those things are actually learned skills that happen later. So when I see a patient who's really new to the country, there's a lot of just orientation to healthcare. Here's my job. I know I'm your doctor, but you get to say no and you get to share in this decision making, which is very different even when you're going through the IOM the migration process you have to do these certain things in order to be able to move to the next step, and you have to do these other things to get to the next step. And all of a sudden you land in the United States, and as a physician, I'm telling you, you have autonomy. You get to say yes, you get to say no, and it's very jarring in the middle of everything else being jarring. How is milk bought here versus back home? How do your kids go to school? The language is completely different. You can't just go to the pharmacy to get your medications. You have to deal with a weather and a climate change that there's nothing that is familiar. Every day, you're getting a little more comfortable, a little more familiar. And that process plays itself out in however people get here. And it's really, really hard. You can imagine, right? My parents left their home at 45. I'm 45 now. And if all of a sudden someone said, here we go, now you're going to live in Belgium, good luck with that, and just left you to your resources. I can imagine it, but it's a very different experience to viscerally experience it or watch someone go through that transition.
I'm sure having gone through it yourself, you understand it better than most, and was wondering if you'd be able to say a few words about coming over when you were 12 and, dealing with the new climate and the new schooling system with this dream of becoming a doctor.
My sister and I, the unique part of our story is when we came here, we initially came for the summer. It was going to be a summer trip. And so my sister and I came here very excited. We'd heard all about America. My parents had been students here in the 70s, and we'd watched enough American movies where we had this romantic idea of what America was going to be like. And so I remember a lot of excitement. Everything that was new was exciting, One time we discovered that Minute Maid made orange juice, but it also made orange soda at that time. There was Minute Maid orange soda. It blew our minds. We're like, it has the same name, but it's totally different. I'm not kidding. We'd fight over who would step on the little things that opened up the automatic doors, So we were kids. It was a big adventure. It was just really, really fun. And we didn't understand. It was when we got out that my parents really made the hard decision to stay. And so the adjustment for me, from my experience of it, was exciting and then supremely disappointing when you start going to school and you're like, well, this is nothing like what I expected. So there was that transition. For my sister, who was probably way wiser than I was, she's younger than me, she had a deeper sense of what we were entering into. And that sense of loss and kind of anxiety around it, I think she felt more than I did. For me, it was just an awesome adventure. And for her, she was more trepidatious, I would say.
And in the story, you talk about this idea of home longing, that your patients, maybe they've been here a short time or maybe they've been here a long time, that they will sometimes have symptoms, illnesses, afflictions that are difficult to categorize. And then you notice that when they make a trip home, their bodies seem to perk up in a way, or I don't know, maybe the pain goes away or something like that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this phenomenon of home longing. I think in an earlier version of your story, you say you wish that there was an ICD-10 code for it, which I thought was really funny, but talk to us more about home longing.
Yes, I see this in my mom and my dad, for example. I see my mom go home and become this very different person than who she is here. And over and over and over, I've seen it with immigrant patients, especially those who have a continued strong connection to home, whether that's family or language or even politics. If there's something that ties them to where they came from, they live with that sense of loss every single day that they're here. Everything is still, even though it's getting familiar, it just doesn't taste the same. It doesn't smell the same. It doesn't look the same. It's just harder to be in your own skin here. And like I said, I notice it a lot in my parents and then in my patients. And then, when you go back to what is familiar, like for me, it's Target, right? I talk about in my story going back to Target. When you go back to what is familiar, your entire being can be present and relaxed, and you can be fully in the space that you occupy because it jives. It makes sense with everything else about you. I've stopped I noticed it, and my friend Rachel, who was in the story, and I talked about it a lot with some of our very chronically ill patients who are really struggling, who are refugees and immigrants, and how it's just lovely when they do get to go home because it's more healing than anything I can do for them here.
I'm sure a lot of it is the sights, the sounds, the smells, just like you said, but I suspect there's also something deeper there about where you came from. And I can't remember if I shared this with you already, but I'm adopted. And so for the first 35 years of my life, I didn't know anything about my ancestors. And it's only been recently that I've gotten some of that information. And I think for a long time, I had this attitude that was kind of like, I don't care, or, I don't need a past. But then once I got the information, it was a very emotional experience. And so I'm just curious to hear you reflect maybe a bit about this idea of like ancestry, where we came from, like staying connected to that while also maybe letting go of that in some way as we evolve and as we change. Like, how do you think about the past and where we came from and its importance in our day-to-day lives?
My heart just like blew up like when I didn't know that about you, Emily. But have you heard about these forests, these trees? So trees talk to each other, right? And if in older forests, there's this whole under the ground, this inner working of like webbing and microorganisms and all these things that connect trees to each other. And when you have a really good, healthy forest, you'll have a maple and a pine that help each other survive through different seasons. So when one is down, the other one is providing nutrients. And you have this whole host of microorganisms underneath too that are helping with communication. And it turns out like the forests that are like established and are interconnected to each other do so much better. And if you take one of those trees and like plant it somewhere else, it just doesn't do it good. It'll grow, but not in the same way as when it's interconnected to its roots. And I mean, nature has like multiple examples of that. And we humans are nature. We are part of nature. We need the grounding and the interconnectedness of us to each other and being able to trace that. I don't know, I think immigrants are just the closest example to seeing that uprooting happen and watching the sequela of that. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm fine, but would I have been just as fine if I lived all my life in Ethiopia? I don't know.
So one thing I liked about your story was that there was an unexpected component where you talk about getting ready to get married and going back home, going back to Ethiopia and being immersed in the sights and the sounds and smells of the place. And I thought the narrative was going to be kind of like this homelonging narrative, which is, I went home and then finally I felt back at home or something like that. But then there's this interesting twist where you actually have to step out of the shop because you're feeling overwhelmed and you're actually home longing for the United States. And so there's been a shift. And for you, home, as you said, is much more complicated. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more to that.
My sister and I talk about this a lot. We talk about this with a lot of our immigrant friends, how we are very much third culture kids. And there's a sense of not fully being American, not fully being Ethiopian. And for years, I lived in that. I just kind of created my third culture. I took a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I created this third culture, this narrative that I had for myself. But there was always this feeling I held on to that, but truly home was Ethiopia. Even though I live here, my connections and rootedness were really going to be in Ethiopia. And we couldn't go back, just our circumstances, we just weren't able to go back. So I didn't travel back a lot when I was a kid. And when I went, I was in my 30s. And it was very interesting to me because there was this initial nostalgia that hit me when I was there. It smells the same. Addis smells exactly the same as it did 40 years ago. And there were, my school was still there. My house was still there. And it was very lovely. But that was the trip where I realized I am very, 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 very American. Home is not there anymore. It's not there anymore. It's not in Ethiopia. It felt like it was sad. It was sad because there was definitely a loss there. I'm like, oh, this place isn't where I'm gonna be. It's not where my heart is. It's not where I'm comfortable. It just isn't home anymore.
That process of what home is changing over time, is that something that you see in your patients too? And do you talk to them about that at all?
So I have a friend who's a genius, Shaili Prasad, who's a genius in refugee and immigrant health. And he actually drew a graph for me on the back of a napkin one time as we were talking about this. And he talks about how there is this initial excitement that most immigrants go through. Then there's a massive disappointment. So my experience of this disappointment with this country. And then you reach this place of kind of a new way of normal, new way of being. And it changes depending on the age that you come. And for a lot of people, though, the same thing happens when they go home. There's this initial nostalgia, there's a massive disappointment, and then they come to this new understanding of their relationship to their new home. So it's interesting because for some people, the bounce up never comes up as high. So for some people, like my patient Haneen, she's like it's never going to be good here. There's not enough connections for her here. There's not enough that she loves here or feels comfortable for her here. It won't be as bad as when she first came, but it'll never be as good as anything that she could get to when she goes home. And then for people like me, it's actually harder for me to go to Ethiopia because it's harder for me to be there than it is to be here. So my level of satisfaction after the initial deployment is much higher. America will never be 100% home for me as it's going to be for my children or as it's going to be for my children's children. I'm always other. There's always otherness that is here. But it's going to feel better for me than if I'm in Ethiopia. Like that change, like what feels comfortable for me is not going to be nearly the same.
So Tseganesh, if you could leave with a message or there was anything that you wanted to say to the Nocturnist audience, what would it be?
I tell medical students this all the time. We start off as first-year students closer to the people that we serve than any other time in our medical career. And as we move on in training, we start getting more specialized language, more specialized skills. We start becoming very different financially, too. We start earning a lot more money than the patients that we serve. And we start becoming more and more isolated from our patients in very unconscious ways. So it isn't intentional. We're just doing our job. We're just going to residency. We just happen to do fellowship, and now we're like cardiovascular surgeon. And I think the more we can start as physicians understanding community as us, we are community. I am a mom who has a PTO, who lives in St. Paul, who goes to this YMCA and shops at this Target, whose laws of this city really affect me in the same pool as my patients. I think the more we can understand that, then I think we can do our works with much more joy. And then I didn't get to say this, and then you realize that you are really deeply held and loved by your community. I can't tell you how many ways that my community, my patients have shown up for me. I'll tell you this quick story. During COVID, our clinic when it first started and we were just figuring out protocols on what was safe and what wasn't safe. As doctors, we were doing the screenings at the front door of my refugee and immigrant clinic. And one of my patients, who's this Somali man who himself is challenged, he's an amputee, had come to the clinic, had come up the stairs. I remember him on his crutches coming up the stairs. And he had sat down. I was trying to use an interpreter, but it wasn't going well. I think he came for a refill. And he points to the mask, and I say to him, I'm sorry, I can't give you a mask. I don't have any to give you. And I kind of move my hands like this. And he leaves. And then soon after, he had gone to the store and bought 2 masks and brought it back for me because he wanted to make sure that I was safe. He was like, you told me you didn't have any masks. And so I went and I bought masks for you. And I just have never felt more held than when he did that. So our community just shows up for us. And so it eases some of the work that we do as physicians.
Tseganesh, it's just such a joy to chat with you and to hear your story. And I cannot wait to give you a big, big hug in April in Minneapolis at our live show.
Thank you, Emily and the whole Nocturnist crew for creating and holding space for all of us. And you're part of the community that holds us up. So really, thank you.
I have been speaking with Dr. Tseganesh Selameab. Tseganesh, thank you again. This episode of The Nocturnist was produced, edited, and mixed by Sam Osborne and produced by Carly Besser. Tseganesh's story was coached by Adelaide Papazolo with support from The Nocturnist Head of Story Development, Molly Rose Williams. It was performed live at The Nocturnist Show Together Again at the Brava Theater in San Francisco in June of 2022. Motoko Honda improvised and performed on piano. The Nocturnist executive producer is Ali Block, our chief operating officer is Rebecca Groves, and Noor Al-Saad is our development and outreach specialist. Our original theme music was composed by Joseph Monroe, and additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. The illustrations for this season of The Nocturnist are by Eva Vasquez. Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. This season of The Nocturnist is sponsored by the Physicians Foundation, which empowers physicians to lead in the delivery of high-quality, cost-efficient healthcare by attending to physician well-being, supporting medical practices sustainability, and helping physicians navigate the changing healthcare system. The Nocturnist is also sponsored by the California Healthcare Foundation and from donations from listeners like you. Thank you so much for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoy the show, please help others find us by giving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. To contribute your voice to an upcoming project or to make a donation, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next week.